The United States emerged from World War II as the world's greatest power in all ways, really, militarily, in manufacturing, and we were the country that had the atomic bomb, really the only country that had the atomic bomb. But our security in this post-war world was really very much dependent upon security in Europe. And the only competitive nation that we had, the one that was kind of threatening our security in some ways, was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union played a really crucial role in defeating Hitler. And in the span of World War II, the Soviet army occupied most of Eastern Europe. And so following the war, they wanted to have a sphere of influence. They wanted the areas in which their army had occupied, they wanted to really be in control of a lot of those areas. Our wartime alliance with the Soviet Union disintegrated very quickly after the war. The first conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union happened in the Middle East, specifically over Iranian oil fields. The Soviet military was making moves to occupy those areas, and the United States did not want the Soviets to have control over those oil fields because we received oil from those areas. Then the Soviet Union was supposed to allow Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania to have free elections, and it kind of seemed like the elections were held, but it certainly didn't seem that they were free elections, that the Soviets had tampered in those elections in some way. And so we were really concerned about that communist ideology pushing them to expand, because in Karl Marx's idea of true communism, it has to be a worldwide thing. And so the United States capitalists are really concerned about that. And so we became very much dedicated to stopping the expansion of communism. Actually, Winston Churchill gave a speech that was known as the Iron Curtain speech, where he talked about an iron curtain being dropped across Europe that was dividing the free West and the communist East. And you can kind of see where that iron curtain was on the map on this slide. In March of 1947, President Truman gave a speech that became known as the Truman Doctrine. And this speech is really what made the Cold War real. Britain was in no ability to aid militarily or financially to Greece or Turkey. They were trying to hold on that Iron Curtain as much as they could, and so Greece and Turkey were kind of the border of that expansion, and they were really trying to push for Greece and Turkey to remain free, but Britain was no longer able to provide that kind of support to prevent the Soviets from overtaking those areas. And so they asked the United States to kind of fill the power vacuum that existed there. The Soviets were certainly interested in that area because it kind of gave them a quick crossroads into the Middle East. And so in this speech, Truman used the rhetoric of the defense of freedom to sway people's opinion, to get support to help out Greece and Turkey. And it's this speech that kind of made the Cold War an ideological conflict. Because of this speech, Congress appropriated $400 million to funnel into Greece and Turkey to help maintain their communist-free governments. And so this kind of set up the United States setting a precedent as having a global responsibility in the fight against the expansion of communism. And so along with this idea, Truman created a new national security body to gather intelligence and to conduct secret military operations abroad. And some of those agencies that were created were the Atomic Energy Commission, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency, which you probably have heard of as the CIA. Military action was only one aspect of the Truman Doctrine, or what kind of became known as containment. Truman's Secretary of State, Marshall, created a plan called the Marshall Plan, and this plan was going along with containment. This is how we can contain communism. If we provide financial aid, and when we talk about financial aid here, we are talking about billions of dollars to the recovery of Europe, because in Europe is devastated. Like, almost the entire continent. I mean, Spain and Portugal are fine, but pretty much everywhere else is devastated by the war, because this war was so far-reaching in Europe. And those terrible conditions really gave strength to communist parties. The communist parties in the immediate post-war years in France and Italy become really, really powerful. And so in the Marshall Plan, we're going to provide billions of dollars in recovery for Europe. It was kind of like a New Deal for Europe, and it was incredibly successful. But what it did do was solidified the division of the continent. It really solidified the placement of that Iron Curtain. In Japan, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the reconstruction of Japan, oversaw the creation of a new democratic constitution, and removed the Japanese military, and oversaw economic reconstruction that was mainly to provide more democratic strength in Asia, to protect the communists from expanding into Asia any more than what it already was. By 1948, the Cold War had become a bit more militaristic. In the aftermath of the war, Germany was split into 4 sections, but mainly 2 sections. So there was a Western Germany and an Eastern Germany. And the Soviets controlled Eastern Germany, or just East Germany. And then the Allies, Great Britain, France, and the United States, were in control of 3 different sections of West Germany. And Berlin is the capital of Germany, but Berlin was centered inside of East Germany. But Berlin itself was also sectioned into West Berlin, East Berlin, with East Berlin being controlled by the Soviets and West Berlin being controlled by the United States, France, and Great Britain. So in order to kind of strengthen the economy of their zone in West Germany, the United States, Great Britain, and France introduced a currency into their zones, a Western currency into their zones. This angered the Soviets, and the Soviets cut off all road and rail traffic to Berlin, because West Berlin was really isolated from the rest of West Germany. After this, what follows is an 11-month airlift where Great Britain, France, and the United States supplied fuel, food, any kind of supplies that were needed to the people of West Berlin. This was eventually lifted in May of 1949, and East and West Germany were officially established. And East and West Germany, East and West Berlin, existed all the way till 1991, when the Berlin Wall finally fell. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb, and following that pushed the United States and other European countries to establish NATO, specifically the United States, Canada, and then 10 other European nations, which you can see on this map. The light and blue colored countries were a part of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the purpose of NATO was to create a mutual defense against any kind of future Soviet attack. And this was specifically to protect West Germany. 6 years later, in 1955, the Soviets formed their own Eastern European alliance, which became known as the Warsaw Pact, which you can see on this map as the countries that are in red. So there was a setback for containment in China. There was a civil war that happened in China in the late 1940s, and Mao Zedong, who was a communist, was victorious in that civil war. The United States refused to recognize that new government and blocked them from taking their seat in the UN Security Council. Altogether, the National Security Council approved a permanent military buildup that allowed the United States to continue their global crusade against communism. This is really established in NSC 68, which was a dramatic increase in military spending. We see the first real test of containment, though, in the Korean War. In the Korean War, the United States, in North Korea, North Korea had become communist, and there was a democratic government that was set up in South Korea. The communists went across that pre-war boundary, isolated all of the South Korean and UN forces, were able to, with United States help, push them all the way back. It kind of goes back and forth, and it really ends in an armistice line that is about the same place. But it was basically divided into Soviet and US zones, really similar to what happened in Germany. And they evolved into two governments. So really this war happens because Truman persuaded the UN Security Council to authorize force to repel an invasion. In this war, though, the United States did the bulk of the fighting. They were led by Douglas MacArthur. China actually comes to North Korea's aid in October of 1950. There's certainly a lot of critics of our reactions to communism. It was impossible. The issue was that it was really impossible to view international crises on a case-by-case basis. How do we know that this is the point where we need to test containment? If you're going to do containment, it has to be containment all the time. It can't just be on these case-by-case bases. World War II also increased global awareness of problems related to imperialism. There were many movements for colonial independence in the years following the war. In 1946, the United States granted independence to the Philippines and really backed off of, they pushed initially to get European countries to give up their colonies, but eventually kind of had to back off of European allies because many were really determined to hold on to their empire. And that determination to hold on to their empire is really going to test the U.S. policy of containment throughout the Cold War, especially in a place called Vietnam.